All right, welcome everybody. The Rockets get a big win in Oklahoma City, 112-106, a game that was televised nationally on ABC. And yes, Oklahoma City was missing their MVP, Shea Gilgeous-Alexander. They were missing a former All-Star, Jalen Williams, and they were missing their underrated third best on-ball guard with AJ Mitchell. At the same time, there's still a good defense, still a good team, and it's a very tough place to play. I've been in Oklahoma City for a Rockets game, and that place is insane. Rockets get a huge win. Tari and Bari were absolutely excellent this whole game. Sengun rebounds after this really rough week with a triple double, and created Amen Thompson out in this game. Kevin Durant, they completely loaded up on him defensively. So this is a really good win, 112-106. I'm here with Ben DuBose. You can follow him on Twitter at Ben DuBose and read him on Rockets Wire and on Clutch Fans, as well as Paulo Alves. Paulo, you can follow Paulo on Twitter at Paulo Alves NBA. You can see the handles underneath them. Guys, this was, yes, they needed to win because a loss would have reflected poorly, but they got a good win in a tough place to play.
And I know the spreadsheet doesn't account for injuries, but this was a spreadsheet loss, right?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. Yes.
And of course, the Rockets aren't going to feel sorry for who the Thunder are missing when Houston's without Amen Thompson and obviously Fred VanVleet and Steven Adams as well. So I think first off, with everything the Rockets absorbed this week, the back-to-back blowout losses at home to the Celtics and the Hornets, all the bad PR after the trade deadline, and then going down 15 early today, they needed this win. This was a team that it felt like was teetering. And if they had lost this game, especially if it was a blowout to the shorthanded Thunder, the way it looked early, that's the kind of thing that can linger. As opposed to you get the win, now you have a couple of days off, you have a back-to-back Tuesday and Wednesday before the All-Star break. This assures that you're not going to go in the All-Star break on some sort of awful losing streak. Like this doesn't, fix everything, but it does give you a chance to catch your breath. I do think some of what's happened, it's an older team. There's a lot of injuries, so the Rockets are running on fumes a little bit, especially with the back-to-backs increasing. And so they just needed to get a win to stabilize. And the fact that it came against the defending champs on national TV, that only helps. But I think the real story today, defensively, the challenge would be a billion times more and will be when the Thunder have SGA and J-Dub. Let's be honest about that. But on the other end of the floor, for the Rockets offensively, I don't think the formula is all that different regardless of who the Thunder have out there, because defensively, they still have their marquee pieces. And they're going to do what they do when it comes to, physically defending Kevin Durant, the intense ball pressure, overplaying the passing lanes. And I do think that relative to that opening night loss in Oklahoma City, the Rockets did some things better today on the offensive end of the court, most notably Tari, Eason, and Jabari Smith Jr. And it makes sense because when a team defends how the Thunder did today, and really how they do all the time, they are conceding driving lanes to guys who normally aren't great drivers and creators. And so Tari and Jabari, you don't think of them as, off the bounce, off the dribble, creative types. But if the defense is overplaying the passing lanes, trying to get those steals, then guys that, you wouldn't think of them as shot creators offensively are going to have opportunities, especially when they're loading up against Kevin Durant. They're loading up against Alperen Sengun, who was in double digits in assists. So credit to him. He used his gravity effectively. I think, this was a good counter from the Rockets. And I'm not going to say that you should assume that they figured it out against the Thunder, because defensively, the challenge is going to go way up when they have SGA and J-Dub. But offensively, it was really ugly in that opening game at the start of the year. It was better tonight primarily because they could trust Tari and Jabari to make plays off the dribble. I think that's essential against a defense like the Thunder and how aggressively they play on the perimeter. So I think this was a huge game for the Rockets confidence-wise, both short-term, just, getting the stench off of the past few days, and then against the Thunder. I do think, at least on the offensive end of the court, it gives the Rockets something that they can build upon moving forward.
Yeah, 100%. But as Dave said, you do have to take into consideration, and it's a massive factor that they don't have their two lead ball handlers, two all-stars. One guy that's in contention for being the best player in the league, even though I don't really believe that, but he's a top 5 guy, no doubt about it. And you also got to take into consideration that the way the Thunder were defending, completely taking away Sengun in whichever ways they could. After that, they were also still getting more attention to Tari and Jabari than they were getting to Dorian Finney-Smith and Josh Okogie, right? They weren't daring those guys to shoot, and those guys shot, and those guys missed a lot, right? Obviously, that's a strategy that they go to, knowing that they need a little bit of an outlier performance-wise from somewhere, right? They need to add variance to this game because they're playing so stressed, so short-handed, right? And it kind of went as good as it possibly could offensively as far as those guys missing shots. Like, those guys could not hit the broadside of a barn. And to be honest, I think there will be a discussion at some point this season if, playing Dorian Finney-Smith is still the go-to. Moving on from that more negative part, I do think that this game is, the latest in a series of games in which Jabari Smith Jr. has played, a lot better than people have been giving him credit for the entire season. He had a 6-game stretch where he played really poorly. And during this 6-game stretch, it seemed like the public opinion of Jabari has completely shifted. And truth is, he is someone who can do things that nobody else on this roster can outside of the top 2 shots, right? The ability to be able to pull up from anywhere and catch what's a better shot than what most back on this team are going to be able to get, just if they are caught in a situation where they have to make something up. And in the playoffs last year, and we've seen it time and time again throughout his career, he is someone who is clutch, who is not afraid to take big shots at big moments. And I just wanted to highlight how good of a game he had and how good his last 10 games are. Over the last 10 games, he's winning 40%. So we can, balance it out. Like, it was really bad there for a moment for a 6-game stretch. But since then, with what is now 11 games, he's been playing really, really well. And without him, the Rockets don't win some of the games they've won.
Yeah, I think the biggest compliment to Jabari is, nobody's talking about Jabari anymore. Like, it was all on Twitter, like everybody was just blaming Jabari for everything. Like, they stubbed their toe, it's Jabari's fault. It was nonstop. And now nobody's talking about him. They've moved on to a man. They've moved on to some other, scapegoat or some other issue. And Jabari's been good. I think you nailed it, Paulo. He's been good. He had a really horrible stretch where he couldn't make shots and it was in his head. That's hopefully past. He is going to have a bad game at some point. He's going to go 3 for 13 in some game, and we're going to have, this get turned back on again. But I'm glad you said that because I do think he deserves a lot of compliments. Tonight was one of his best games. What I loved about Jabari, and Jabari's not the lead story of this game. I want to be clear. We just started talking about Jabari, but 9 of 11, he took 11 free throws. He was physical, and he was forcing the issue at times, and he got to the line. That's not something we see very often from Jabari. Also, Tari, this was a game where Tari was incredibly aggressive as far as seeking his shot. 26 points on 22 shots is not like the greatest efficiency, but he was really good. Hit 5 of 13 from 3. Tari took 13 3-point shots today. So I thought those guys, in the fact that Amen is out, and Amen in this particular game with none of those lead ball handlers being here, maybe you don't need Amen quite as much. You're going to need him against SGA. You're going to need him against Jalen Williams and AJ Mitchell and those guys. But tonight, I thought with him out and KD, them really loading up on KD, Jabari and Tari really stepped up. And Sengun was terrific too. We're going to talk about him and his triple-double. But I was really impressed with how those guys did in a time that they needed more volume from them.
And then a very odd game from Reed Shepherd. Early in the game, defensively, he was terrible. That was a big part of how the Rockets dug that 15-point hole. And he had 4 turnovers that were just killers, including one with like 3 minutes left when Rockets had a chance to put the game away. Instead, next thing you know, the Thunder get a transition layup and it's back down to 4. I think they end up cutting it to 2. But Reed was 7 of 12, 16 points, 6 assists, and he only made 1 3. So he was 6 of 8 from inside the arc. And so Tari and Jabari were the lead story offensively in terms of how they, punished the Thunder for overplaying on the perimeter. Dave, I love that you mentioned how aggressive Jabari was at getting to the line. When he was able to get the Thunder in a tough spot, he leaned into the contact. He showed some craft that we haven't always seen in the past. But Reed as well, 6 of 8. Not a perfect game from Reed. The first half, he was terrible defensively. Throughout, he had issues with turnovers. But in terms of, getting to the bucket, he had 2 or 3 layups and a couple of mid-range shots as well. I think that's what you have to do against this Thunder defense. And I really think, the Thunder were missing their guys offensively, but defensively, they had the pieces they need. And so what Reed, Tari, and Jabari did offensively, to me, that's the key to eventually having a chance to beat the Thunder. I'm not saying that's going to happen this season. The Rockets have their issues right now. So no, let's not act like the Rockets are ready to go toe-to-toe with the Thunder in a playoff series. But eventually, whenever that time comes, when you want to really challenge them, like I think on offense at least, this is at least the initial blueprint. Now, maybe if Reed and Tari and Jabari do it enough, then they've relaxed their defense against the likes of KD and Sengun, and the stars can get going a little bit more. But for right now, I think the formula from not just Tari and Jabari, but Reed as well, that's exactly how you have to attack this Oklahoma City defense. So, Paolo, I'm curious what you think about Reed, because it was just, to be a fascinating game. Some of the issues with defense and especially turnovers were terrible, but offensively, I mean, he helped them out in the half court.
Yeah, 100%. And they especially needed him to, because the man was not there. We saw a lot of minutes from JD Davison, your guy, that's patented Ben DuBose guy. And he did play well. Had some boneheaded decisions that are expected from a player that doesn't play with the main team for that many or doesn't have that many opportunities. But touching on Reid, it's as you said, during that first half, it was actually kind of appalling the way he was playing defense. And to shift the conversation a little bit to the defensive side, because you guys have heard me the entire season. Me, the offense is, good enough as long as defense steps up to something close to the caliber that it was last season, right? And Reed was a big part of why the defense is for, but the defense with this team is for not just because of Reed, but because it seems like the main, like Reed, KD, and Sengun, and I'm not excluding KD from this conversation. He has some responsibility on this as well. Take turns just falling asleep defensively, and the way the Rockets try to defend, and the way the Rockets try to emulate the kill switch system that they were running last season, it requires everybody to be locked in and everybody to be high effort running, closing out, and compensating for when those guys switch. And it just seems like guys are taking turns having breakdowns defensively, and it feels like when you watch it play by play, you could kind of point your finger at anybody, because at any given time, one of those guys is having those troubles. And it really goes to show why this team seems to be able to get themselves in a hole against any team. Like this OKC team should not have any business being competitive with the Rockets, even with that defense, the defense being as good as it is. Offensively, the Rockets should not be giving up 106, I believe, 106 points to this team that has basically nobody that can create their own shot at this moment, right? And the Rockets from last season would not have done that. And so, given that being said, I do want to give credit to Sengun for the second half. A lot of the issues that Rockets have had, other than players falling asleep, has been effort-wise. Right? I cannot count the amount of times that a guy is, Sengun is in a position to help on a drive, right? And he just doesn't contest a shot at the rim that's happening right in front of him, as you would expect any other student in the league. And this game, especially in the second half, earlier on, it was a little bit rougher. I don't know if somebody issued a challenged him personally at halftime or whatever it may have.
Yeah, there were jumper cables used, I think. Yeah.
And someone pointed out in the comments that Sengun's energy really picked up after the three he made and then the flamingo shot. I noticed that too. Like when it started going better for Sengun offensively, the energy for defense picked up too.
And a lot of it comes from, not wanting to burn Sengun or whatever it may be, but Sengun has, limitations as far as his length and as far as his athleticism goes. His best ability is being smarter than other players, thinking faster, and he does have above average mobility on the ground for a guy his size, right? So the way he can weaponize those things is by thinking faster than other people and reaching the spots faster, and I guess contesting earlier than what players are expecting him to. That turnover that it generated off of Cat, right? That was a foul, but he was quick to jump on the opportunity, knowing what was going to happen, figuring out what was going to happen faster than it happened, and being there at the point of contention. If Cat there gets the ball and gets the post up, then it's a lot more difficult for him to put up a defensive effort, because he doesn't necessarily have the tools to do so. And the same happens, he had multiple blocked shots where he got beat, recovered, and blocked the shot. That only happens if the moment you get beat, you immediately, move your legs, shift your body position to be able to be in a position to contest the shot afterwards. That's something that he hasn't been doing earlier on. As I said before, I cannot count the amount of possessions in earlier games this season where someone's driving right at him and he chooses to lazily just box out, hit the center, rather than contest the shot. You got to contest the shot and force the players to make the play and drop the ball off to the center. That's how defenses play, right? You force an extra decision and you hope that someone can pick up the guy that you just had open. If you're not putting up the initial resistance and forcing that extra effort from the offense, especially in the scheme that Rockets run, you're never going to get that success defensively that you want. And that's why teams like the Pacers, teams like the Kings, teams like these extremely short-handed Oklahoma City Thunder are able to stay in games with the Rockets up until very, very late because they are always a cold stretch from 3 away from being down double digit and struggling to come back.
I will say, though, one thing you've noted in the past, Dave, people think of you as a Sengun hater, if you will. Well, probably all three of us are thought of as Sengun haters. To be real, everybody is.
Number one, though. I hope I'm
Okay,
glad to get
you're taking the number one spot?
Go ahead, though. Yeah.
But one thing to your credit that you've always said in his favor is that he tends to get up for these bigger games. And, the defending champs on the road, national TV. And as far as his, assignments, both Chet and Hartenstein were playing. Now, I know if you have SGA going downhill, obviously you're going to be able to attack Sengun in a lot of different ways. The Thunder tonight just didn't have the guys in the perimeter to really challenge Sengun in that way. But I just thought overall the intensity from the jump was better. And then especially in the second half, it picked up. And, he's got a lot of warts, but that's one positive. He does seem to play with a higher intensity for these bigger games. I've heard you say it before, Dave. And, the Warriors series last year, he wasn't at his most efficient. But I thought, especially early in the series, when a lot of the young guys, it took them some time to get their legs underneath them to adjust to the intensity of the playoffs. Sengun was a guy from the start. You remember the dunk he had over Draymond? He was the one young guy who did seem to embrace the moment, embrace the stage. And so that's not meant to, try and wash away what we've seen the last couple of months when he's been below average defensively. No, that's a very real consideration. Going into today, the Rockets were almost 8 points worse in net defensive rating with Sengun playing this year. Last year, they were 3 points better. So it's definitely been a decrease. And it's not to say that today, outweighs all the negatives from the last couple of months. But it is a reminder that there is, in these bigger games, when the spotlight is on, he does have an extra gear. It would be nice to see it more frequently, but at least this was a reminder that he still has it in him, right?
Yeah, I want to talk about Reed, or just chime in on Reed, but let me go Sengun first. I mean, I'm really happy to see Sengun have this game: 17 points, 12 boards, 11 assists, had 3 steals, 3 blocks, including that one on, I believe, Cason Wallace, where Wallace got past him and he recovered and blocked it. And you heard Sengun, sort of yell at, the fans and stuff. He was pumped up. His defense was better, definitely. I thought he stepped that up. He needed this in the worst way. We talked about this before. I haven't seen anybody get hit this hard PR-wise in a while. Like he had the defense got focused on the ESPN show, got focused on the ABC, his defense. And then of course the issue with the female official in Boston, we're seeing people who don't even know who Alperen Sengun is trashing him on social media. It's crazy right now. So he's taking a beating. He needed this to rebound. I thought he played well. And with the men out, he was definitely the guy. I mean, they were hitting threes. They started out, the Rockets, hitting their first 4. Then they went into a cold spell. And that's really how Sengun was, racking up those assists. He was finding those guys out on the perimeter. And I thought that was something that was interesting about this game as well. 43 threes for the Rockets I'm going to have to check. It's probably rare. We don't see that very often. We see many games 16, 20, low 20s. It's good to see them do this. This is what I kind of want to see. And I just wanted to chime in on Reed because Reed is somebody that I agree with all the people in the chat saying that this is a guy who needs to play. You got to play Reed. I totally agree. I don't know if people are trying to have both. In other words, this is a special KD year. We have to win now, but we also need to play Reed. Maybe those two things align. But I think we saw in the first half, he was -8, -9. There was a lot of defensive moments today with Reed that were rough. He had the 4 turnovers, including one in crunch time that you kind of held your breath for a little bit. But he does make winning plays here and there, and I want to see him play and develop. You just have to really decide if you're willing to, maybe sacrifice a game or 2, because that can happen with younger players who are gaining experience. So that's all I'll say on that.
Yeah, 100%. And to the point on threes, keep in mind the Rockets didn't have Amen or Steven Adams today. So many of the low 3 games by volume were when Amen, Sengun, and Steven were playing extended minutes together. And so that's 3 of your 5 that are non-spacers. Generally today, you only had one non-shooter out there, and Sengun even made a 3 today. So I think when you have the pieces that they had today, you almost have to shoot threes at volume to have a chance. And kudos to Ime and the Rockets, they did. Sorry for interrupting, Paolo. You can go.
No, I was gonna touch on something that they said that I thought was really valid. The thing about people saying you can't have your picking in the two. You can't say the special KD year and at the same time say, hey, we gotta play recap for the lot, right? And I want to reach back to something that Rafael Stone said in the post deadline press conference, which was we're not a developmental team, and I think a lot of us being a developmental team or not is Reed Shepherd, right? The other guys pull their own weight; they're gonna get better, right? But they pull their own weight at this point, right? There's a difference between being there's a middle ground between being a full on contender and being a full on developmental team. This team's not rebuilt. This team is contending, right? But the best way for this team to reach its maximum potential with the pieces that it currently has is by playing these young guys and hope they get better. Because if these guys are done developing, and they're not going to get better at any point throughout the next few years of their careers as is expected because they're really young, then this team's never going to be a 1A contender because, our guys are good. They're not 1A best player on a championship team good yet. But we need these guys to develop in order for us to be that team eventually. So it's not a developmental team. We're not prioritizing, minutes to young guys over winning. But at the same time, if the price is low enough on giving these guys extra minutes, then I do understand the decision, for example, for not bring in or not spend assets on a veteran point guard when, it's not a developmental team, but there's still a middle ground here where if the upgrade's not big enough, you might as well give the minutes to someone who is going to be a part of your future.
Oh, go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say, let's talk about the trade deadline a little bit because
Can I chime in with one Sengun thing before we go?
Go ahead.
It's just I was going to say you mentioned he hit the three, and I did want to make a point about that because it did when he hit that three. I'm like, man, he must love this arena because going back to the first game, he hit 5 threes and it was coming on the heels of Eurobasket where he was hitting threes like consistently. And you're like, did he really just learn to become a good 3-point shooter in like 3 weeks? Like, how did this happen? And then he set that first impression, kind of like the dunk over Draymond. Like he sets this first impression and you're like, wow. I mean, I have to admit that was a moment where I was like, this could be something where I just didn't, foresee him doing this. And that three he hit tonight is the 5th one in like over 2 months that he's made. And that's just in contrast to him hitting 5 in that first game. I think it's something he does need to have because Amen can't. Amen needs to do it too. I'm not taking anything away from that. But Amen has so many elite qualities that it makes it so if you're going to have a primarily offensive center, you need him to be versatile. Sabonis can do it. Jokic can do it. Sengun needs to add that range too. I think he's close, but for whatever reason, it's really slipped off. And tonight, it's nice to see him hit one. Go right into the trade deadline. It's fine.
Okay. Couple little things. I'll save the JD Davison discussion for the end. That ties into today's game as well, but that's more about the buyout market because I do think there's an interesting conversation to be had about, is JD better than a lot of the options that are out there on the buyout market if the Rockets simply play him? We'll talk about that in a few minutes. As far as bigger picture takeaways, you mentioned KD and the win now emphasis. One thing I posted in the Rafael Stone press conference thread today on Clutch Fans, I just wanted to remind people. So the KD trade agreement was reached on June 22nd of last year. On June 18th, I reported, and I think some other people did as well, but I reported this on Jackson Gatlin's show, Locked on Rockets, and I bumped it today. The Rockets had made it clear that Fred VanVleet was not going to be a part of the KD trade talks because they didn't think they were a good enough team for KD to be worthwhile if they lost Fred. And lo and behold, 3 months later, just a freak accident, and they lose Fred. So a lot of these people that are talking about the lack of alignment, you bring in Kevin Durant, but then you don't go all in. The Rockets wouldn't have brought in Kevin Durant if they had known they wouldn't have Fred. They specifically kept Fred out of the talks for that reason. So this is not PR spin after the fact. They said it. I reported it before the trade. This was their mindset. Now, after Fred got hurt, obviously they tried to spin it as well. We hope we can still contend. We'll give more reps to Amen and Reed, yada, yada. I mean, what else are they going to say? I mean, one of your most important players gets hurt right before training camp. What are you going to say? Oh, the season's over, pack it up? No, I mean, they're going to put on a brave face, but the proof is in the pudding. They knew last June that they needed Fred to have a chance at contending with KD. So Fred going down, it does put them in a tough spot where they know they have Kevin Durant playing amazing basketball, but it's really tough to actually win a championship this year unless Fred comes back. And even if Fred does come back, he's probably going to be limited. That's important context to remember about the deadline overall. If it seems like there's not alignment between the KD trade and the lack of deal making at this deadline, well, there was a big variable in between that changed the thinking that went into the KD trade and the thinking at the deadline. Secondly, there's a lot of comments in the chat about Dorian Finney-Smith. So one reason the Rockets were boxed in at the deadline, one big reason. So they went into the first apron hard cap. They used their non-taxpayer mid-level to sign DFS. And to this point, it hasn't worked out. Hopefully, he didn't look good today, missed a lot of open shots. I did think he was moving a little bit better, but on the balance, certainly not a positive game for him. And so hopefully he's only been playing about 5 to 6 weeks. And so hopefully by the end of the season, he's closer to the guy he's been the last couple of years. And he was clearly a positive role player for the Lakers and the Nets. But if it doesn't work out, there is something to be said for mitigating the damage. And so, the Rockets, by limiting their flexibility, if not for signing DFS, they wouldn't have been hard capped at the first apron. You could have used the disabled player exception that you got for Fred VanVleet. So, the DFS signing to this point has absolutely hurt them. It's a big part of why they were boxed in. But if you trade him at the deadline, and he was the most movable piece from a salary perspective, especially because now you need Clint Capella as your primary backup center with no Steven Adams. If you move DFS at the deadline for a pending free agent, which that's most of the players getting dealt, like a Kobe White, and it doesn't move the needle, you're probably not going to win a championship with Kobe White. And then you go into the offseason and you need a big trade. You can't trade Kobe White as part of that package. So you lose the salary slot as well. Even in the worst case scenario, Dorian Finney-Smith is still an expiring contract this summer that can help you with trades. So the absolute worst case scenario will be the Rockets trade DFS for Kobe White. And then let's say DFS looks better by the playoffs and you don't even have the salary slot in the summer. So that's what the Rockets are trying to balance here. And that's a big part of this. You can question the DFS signing. It definitely did limit them, and they did know he had the ankle surgery. But it's not as simple as saying just make the deal and get something rather than nothing. No, there's a risk if you move him too, and I think that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I don't mean to interrupt, but it's almost like to illustrate it from an extreme example, you could be choosing between Kobe White now or like Giannis in the summer. There are other things that you could add, I guess, but he is a piece that's key for, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, I'm not trying to, put words in your mouth, but he is a piece that could be used in a bigger trade because he's going to be expiring next year.
Someone in the chat, DFS is a negative asset going into the deadline, so Stone didn't want to sell low. Bingo. If you wait until the summer, he's at least going to be a neutral asset because he's an expiring contract. If you tried to use him now, you'd be selling low. He'd be a negative asset. So you better get pretty good bang for your buck, which I don't think Kobe White is, especially now that he has a calf injury as well. And so that's the point. It's not to say that, that everything is sunshine and roses. No, I mean, to this point, the DFS signing hasn't worked out. And the fact that it hard caps you at the first apron is why you couldn't use the injury exception you got for Fred. So you can question Rafael Stone if you want. I'm just saying it's not as simple as just cut bait as soon as possible and get a warm body. No, at least if you go into the summer, you do have some trade optionality. And by the way, kudos to Tillman Fertitta for being willing to pay the luxury tax on that as well.
I do think that besides what Ben said, and I think someone in that said as well, that's really valid, that they would be selling low on Dorian Finney-Smith, and they would never be trading Clint Capella without having a replacement lined up because, well, he's the only backup center at this point. But I just think that even more important, that makes sense from a micromanaging of assets standpoint. From a team performance standpoint, it's more about, do you really believe that trading for a guy like Kobe White, for example, is gonna be what pushes this team over the top? Do we think we're close enough to a team with the likes of OKC, who seems to be a dynasty happening at this moment? It's only been one championship, but they are by far the favorites to win this year again. Is this what's going to bring you over the top to beat a team like that? The Warriors are obviously an outlier, but go back to those years. Would you have spent those assets to get someone who wasn't going to impact the team that much, trying to contend earlier in that Warriors dynasty, or would you have rather had those assets at the time where James Harden was in his prime and you had Chris Paul and you truly could make a dent on a team like that? I do think the one not only is OKC really good, it's always a bit unrealistic to expect. And I do not agree with Stone saying outright, coming in public and saying, hey, perhaps this is not our year. I don't think that's a good message to put across, especially for the player. I just think he made a mistake communication-wise there. But if we're being brutally honest, this team going into the season fully healthy was expected to be, a little bit below the Thunder going into the season, right? Now they have lost two key starters that bring skill sets that we don't have on the team, Brethren Wade and Steven Adams. Yeah, 40 million in cap is my next point. 40 million in cap, and that is now basically dead cap for this season. Is any version of this team with 40 million in cap market and two starters actually going to contend, or actually going to put up that big of a fight against the Thunder that it's worth further investing on, rather than and not doing anything is still investing. You're just investing instead of investing assets on someone to a point guard to come play for the team and be better immediately. You're still investing, but you're just investing minutes instead of assets. At some point, you've got to be pragmatic. You were not favored to beat the Thunder coming into the season. You now have two less starters, 40 million less in cap space. Pragmatically, do you still believe that you're going to be able to beat the Thunder? And that's the job of the GM. The job of the GM is not to listen to social media or to go on whims on a game-by-game basis, playing poorly, or because everybody on national media is saying that the team needs a point guard. The job of the GM is to be pragmatic and to plan for this season and season moving forward. And I think going into next season, if things go according to plan, we'll be thankful that nothing was done in this deadline. Because I bet you, if the Rockets are a first or second round exit this year, Kobe White was not going to get them across to the finals.
So as far as buyout candidates, this is just my hunch. I don't have any inside info or anything. I just look at this, reading the tea leaves, as a guy I think that they would go after. I'm sure I'm going to make some of the people who want offense dry heave with this suggestion. But the Pelicans, Kevon Looney, I think he's sitting there not playing. And this is a guy who is basically a Steven Adams light, but he can switch on defense. Now, he's 30 years old. There were some washed allegations in the past, but he's smart. He's disciplined. He's got a 7'4" wingspan. He has that kind of special rebounding quality, and he can switch on defense. He's comes from a switching program. I am just guessing here. I think that that's somebody that they want. That's who I think would fit, and who we'll see if the Pelicans buy him out.
And he's played off of other stars in the past. We know the roles he's had on those Golden State teams.
That's it.
So I think playing alongside KD and Sengun, he would be a good fit in a complementary role. He's the type of guy that's not going to look good on a rebuilding team. By the way, question for either of you. Two-way players, are they eligible for the playoffs if they're on a two-way contract? I think they are.
Oh, goodness. That is a Beamer question. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Paulo, do you know?
I do not know, but I don't see how they would. And I don't remember in the past two-way player for us playing in the playoffs. Not that was all.
No. Well, the reason I bring it up, and if someone in the chat wants to answer that question, Google it for us because I'm commenting live. The reason I ask, people want a point guard, and I understand why. But theoretically, you can use J.D. Davison, who's already on your roster, in that role, and use the open roster spot and your one buyout slot that you have room for under the first apron to sign a Kevon Looney, to sign a third big, to get you back to the formula when it was, Sengun, Steven, and Clint. Not that Looney's going to be Steven, but, something closer to the original formula. Now, the trade-off is that if you use your buyout spot on a guard, or if you use it on a center, then you're not using it on a guard. So could J.D. Davison be your traditional point guard? I thought he looked good today. I wish Ime would explore more. He made a couple of threes, which is always the big variable. But you are getting close. I think you're at 43, 44 games now of the 50 that JD is allotted under the two-way contract. So you're probably going to need to convert him at some point if you want him to be available the rest of the season. Maybe you could save him as an option for the playoffs and keep him on the two-way, but I'm not sure if that's doable, and it may not be realistic if he's not playing in the regular season. Then I don't know how realistic it is to expect him to potentially have a role in the playoffs. But that's just one thing to keep in mind. Like J.D. Davison, he looked good today, and he could be a consideration. Maybe he's better than these, buyout point guards that are going to be out there, but you may have to make a decision because he's coming up on that 50-game limit on his two-way. So I'm curious what the two of you think about the likelihood of just keeping Shady and doing that as opposed to the buyout market.
My 2 cents is I believe, I know people aren't gonna like this. I would be a little surprised if it was a Chris Paul thing, but I will say I think that they still believe in Amen and Reed and developing those guys. They don't want it's not that they couldn't use somebody like a Chris Paul or someone else or something like that. I think that they still wanna play those guys the bulk of those minutes. Davison can contribute as well. I would be surprised if they added a guy who plays significant minutes over those.
Someone in the chat says that, and don't hold us to it, but someone Googled and says that Davison on a two-way would be eligible for the playoffs because he signed his two-way contract prior to the start of the regular season. So he would be postseason eligible. However, to keep him on the two-way, he wouldn't be eligible to play once he hits the 50 mark. So that's just something to keep in mind. I don't know how realistic it is to expect him to potentially be a playoff option if he barely plays the next 2 months. So, you might have to realistically give Davison a standard contract if you want that to be viable. But at least it's theoretically an option that even if you keep him on the two-way and you use the open roster spot for a center, you could conceivably still have Davison as an option in the playoffs. Because I do think he looked good today. Let's just say that. Like, defensively, he's so trustworthy, even though he hasn't played. And offensively, he just doesn't make the mistakes that Reed does. And, the Rockets internally sort of view Reed as a two guard. Like, that was part of the reason that they weren't that keen on Kobe White. They see the two of them very similar in playing styles. And so there's going to be some matchups, as we saw today, where you can play Shady and Reed together. And so that's something to consider moving forward.
And Paulo, I'll let you go, but Cam Thomas, I can't see that personally. But I could be wrong, but I can't see it. Go ahead.
He is KD's boy, but I can't see it.
This seems like the least Ime Udoka type player that I've ever seen, maybe ever.
Cam Whitmore's close. It's a good battle, but
That's close. That's a good one. Regarding JD Davison, I keep saying this, and it's interesting why it didn't happen this game. But I do think that Aaron Holiday is still ahead in the depth chart, or should be. I just think he's a better player. He gives you a different dimension as a shooter, a lot more confident as a shooter. I do think that he's better. And I think defensively, we saw at times last season that he could be trusted on that side of the court as well. But regarding your point, and then judging from what we've heard and what we've seen in the past, I am with Dave, but I do think that they are going to give those reps to a man in to Reed rather than get further insurance on that. On a point guard, I do think that Looney is a really good scout, especially because I don't know if he still is, but he used to be very mobile. And as we said before, with the scheme the Rockets play, guys that run around a lot are especially valuable. And you do need insurance in case something happens to the brothers, why you need to depend on the defenders on the roster. As far as other guys that may be available through the buyout market, that I do think that are under people are not giving it a real chance that they get bought out, but I think they might. I think the Bulls have a lot of point guards, and they do have Josh Giddey, who is kind of a point guard, kind of not. That's going to take a lot of those out as well. I do think that it's realistic that someone like Anthony Sampson get bought out. Whether that is a fit for the Rockets is a different question because he is poor defensively. He's a really small guard, but he is a good shooter. But I think another thing that goes into the bucket of reasons for running Reed and the men is that there are certain things that you're only going to find out once you play in playoffs, right? Even regarding, we said this before last season about the guys last season. Without that series, we would not have seen that Sengun seems to be a playoff rise or someone who's not afraid of the spotlight. Jabari Smith Jr. Saying that stands true for a man on a bigger role and for Reed on a role at all that it didn't have last season. So seeing how those guys play in those situations is also something that, just from a data collection standpoint, is very important. And as rough as I'm gonna say this, but it's not the nicest thing to say. It does give the front office some comfort in the sense that it was a lot easier to move on from Jalen Green last season after the playoff series that he had. If those guys have the men's obviously untradeable, but if Reed goes into the playoff series and we see that he's unplayable or that he's having a really tough playoff series offensively, which is less likely than him being unplayable defensively, but could still happen, that does give the front office cover in case they want to put him in a trade cover with the fan base. Is what I mean, because he's one of the most beloved guys, right? And once you see how he looks in the playoffs, I don't think that's a factor in the way they are making a decision, but I do think it's something that's going to happen. And when we see them play, we'll see all of those untested, I guess, skills or lack thereof these guys may have.
And speaking of Jalen, I mentioned the Rockets wouldn't have done the KD trade if Fred had to be included. The way it turned out, not only did they sort of do the KD trade while losing Fred because of the injury, but they lost Jalen and Dylan as well. Like, losing Fred would have been a non-starter by himself, but then you lost Fred and 2 other starters.
Yeah.
So that's why, if it seems like there's not alignment, it's a really tough spot that the Rockets were in. One last thing in the chat that I want to address before we hop out. Well, no, I lied. 2 things. One will be very quick. Someone mentioned potentially cutting Aaron Holiday, converting Davison, and then using Holiday's roster spot for a center. The problem there is going to be the first apron hard cap. Like, you can make the roster spots work that way, but I don't know if you'd have the money to sign both a buyout guy and then convert Davison to a standard. So if there wasn't a hard cap, I think you could, but I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think that would work. A little more depth. Someone has mentioned this several times. I keep seeing Giannis deep down. You guys know that won't happen because it costs too much. What are your other big moves that could be made this summer? I'll throw in one very quickly. I'll let both of you chime in if you want. I'm watching the Kyrie Irving situation in Dallas. Now that they've moved Anthony Davis, it's a clear rebuild. The Rockets have the Mavs 2029 pick. His salary is big, but not huge, $39 million. He's 34 years old, coming off a torn ACL, so they don't have a ton of leverage. So the Mavs have an incentive to play ball with the Rockets. I think Kyrie would want to play in Houston because of his ties to Kevin Durant. I haven't heard anything, but to me, if they need something a little lower cost, but potentially big impact, there's a lot of dots that connect there. So that's the one, aside from Giannis, that I'm sort of monitoring. Do either of you have
Kawhi comes to mind as a possibility. I think obviously we'll see how it plays out. AD is another one. I'm not saying he's high on this list. I'm just saying these are the guys that you might get moved in this sort of bigger salary type of situation. But I don't know. And to add to that, I'll let you, Paulo, answer that. But to add to that, I think you nailed it, Ben. Is like they have the first apron hard cap right now. They're not going to be hard cap next year. And to add to like the compliment you gave Tillman Fertitta about, being willing to spend the luxury tax, they're going to be willing to spend next year, and they're not going to be hard capped. I'm really encouraged by the position they're in. I think they're going to, people who want to add a bunch of players right now, I get it, the frustration, but I think they're all going to be in a good position this summer to make a big move.
Yeah, I do agree. I do agree with that. Regarding potential guys that we could trade for, I'm actually looking at it a slightly different way. For example, a guy like Kawhi, right? To me, is not as enticing because I think the most meat on the bone that there is for this team, as I've said plenty of times, is defense. And Kawhi is a good defender, but I don't think what we're missing on defense is individual good defender. I think we're missing high effort guys. I think we're missing guys that are willing to run that deals with his system, that are willing to go and make up for other players that have to leave the assignments for in order to run that scheme. And I don't think Kawhi at this stage in his career is that. Just like KD, he's an individual good defender, but he doesn't seem at this point in his career to be the guy that's going to be running around 100% of the possessions. He does do that to some extent in some possessions, but at this point, at 37 years old, it's expected that he won't be. And I'm afraid that in order for us to maximize something on defense, we need guys like that. So I do think that there's a possibility that there is a bit great, but it is for a high effort defensive guy that's, a really high end stud.
Like a Jaden McDaniels type?
Like a Dylan Brooks type.
Oh, okay.
Let's go get
Colin
Boyles. I'm interested in Colin Murray Boyles. We'll never
interested in him last year.
Yeah. This guy's going to be good, really good. But there's no way Toronto's partying with him at this point. But that's somebody that I think is fascinating. I would love to look at some younger players that are going to cost a little bit more, but that's tough to pull off. But I think that guy's got really special potential. Undersized, can play 5 and 4, and very versatile defender. But we'll see. Obviously,
and I do think from a trade perspective, that 27 Brooklyn swap is going to put the Rockets in a good position to deal with the Nets or anybody else, because the Nets are going to be so young. I don't care if they try to win, because they no longer have an incentive to tank, that pick is still going to be pretty high because they're going to be so young. They're not going to win games. So that 27 Brooklyn swap, whether the Rockets keep it or trade it, that's a lot of leverage that they will have on the market.
And every East team now outside of Brooklyn, even Washington, which is the one that's down there with Brooklyn, makes a case for being pretty good next year. Now, Brooklyn might be able to sign somebody, but Brooklyn looks like they're set up to be pretty bad next year, and they have no incentive to tank next year. But yeah, that could be good. It's just, for me, it's the draft pool. How good is the draft pool going to be? Because that's when the 26th is so good. Your guy in Missouri. But and that's the question I have. But it looks like the Rockets are holding on to a good pick. We'll see with Phoenix, but Brooklyn's looks good.
I do think that is, you mentioned McDaniels from the Timberwolves. I think the Rockets might not want to do that because they would be giving Minnesota the ammo to potentially go after a guy like Giannis is available. But I do think that there's two other names that are worth considering. One of them I already said it, and I didn't say a guy like Dillon Brooks. I meant Dillon Brooks at all. It might make sense for the Rockets to give 2027 back to Phoenix, allow them to tank in exchange for Dillon Brooks. Who knows if that's a possibility? But I do think that a lot of our problems are because Dillon Brooks is not there, both from a leadership perspective and from an energy perspective. And the other guy that I did want to touch on that's perhaps not known as a good high effort defender because, well, he's really good at something else. But I do think actually Murphy fits the bill as well as a higher cost guy that's not quite a star, but would be a high cost guy that we would need that during finishing his contract.
Yes, absolutely. I know anything you guys want to say before we close up. I know we've gone long today, but it was definitely a lot to talk about with the deadline and everything else. But Ben, Paulo, anything you guys want to add?
One last thing I wanted to address. You mentioned Sengun taking a bad PR hit this week, and you didn't even mention the post-game press conference that went viral when Ime had the line about they've done that since I've been here.
Oh,
so it sounded funny, and everybody jumped on it. But just to add some context, the question was about teams hunting Sengun on switches, and honestly, I don't think Ime intended it to come across nearly as harshly as it did. It became, this firestorm on social media. But I mean, even Sengun at his best defensively, look, big men in the NBA get attacked. Like every team's base offense is to try and get their lead guard, if they have one that's worth their salt, against a big and just to, try and make something happen and then read and react from there. That's almost every team's base offense. And the Rockets have had to do that the same way every team with a traditional big man has to, scheme around that. And I think that's what Ime meant. And it just came across in that moment of frustration because, he's sort of pouting. They all are. They've been, blown out on back-to-back nights at home. And it came across like he was throwing Sengun under the bus. I don't think that's what he meant. I think he was just speaking to the fact that, it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that they've been dealing with for years, the same way that, hell, even Minnesota with Rudy Gobert. Gobert gets challenged in that same way, one-on-one by, big-time guards. Look what Luka did to him in the playoffs a couple of years ago. Like, this happens to every traditional big man. So I don't think Ime meant it nearly as harshly as it came across. That's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Paulo, you good?
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Appreciate you guys and appreciate everyone who hanging around with us tonight for over 50 minutes. It's a good win for the Rockets. They come back home now, play the Clippers twice. These are not easy games. They should be a lot easier than they were. I'll say that. No Zubac, no Harden. I believe Darius Garland is still out. They have Kawhi, who's playing great, but it's not the same team that was 17-4 and really moving up the charts. So hopefully they can win those two games. And then I think after that, it's All-Star break, or maybe it's Charlotte first. I can't remember. Then you have at Charlotte, at New York.
One last thing, Paulo, I think your audio dipped. Someone in the comments is asking who fits the bill well. Your second target after Dillon. Who did you list?
Oh, Trey Murphy from the Pelicans.
Yeah, Trey Murphy. That's what I thought you said. But yeah, your audio did break up very briefly then. So glad you clarified. Anyway,
Gotcha.
Go on.
Awesome. Appreciate everybody. Thanks for subscribing and listening. And we will be back for Rockets get a good long break. The rest of this day off, Sunday, Monday, and then they'll play on Tuesday and Wednesday. So we will see you guys then. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.